Today marked the most embarrassing moment in Mayor Tiffany Henyard's career. The courtroom was packed, cameras rolling, and the judge had just finished reading the verdict. The tension in the room was palpable, and as the judge's words echoed through space, Henyard suddenly stormed out, making it seem like a scene from a political drama. Her outburst was unexpected, and it was clear this was more than just a result of the trial. Was it the mounting corruption charges catching up with her? The financial secrets coming to light? Or was it the realization that her own supporters had turned against her? Whatever it was, Henyard had lost control for months. Henyard had been dodging accusations of corruption, financial mismanagement, shady business deals, and power-hungry behavior. But today it all came to a head. The courtroom was filled with murmurs and whispers, with many wondering what had set her off. Was this the beginning of the end for Dalton's leadership? Or just another dramatic chapter in Henyard's increasingly turbulent career? Reporters, political analysts, and regular citizens packed into every available seat in the courtroom. They were all eager to witness what would come next for the mayor, who had once been a symbol of local power and political clout. But today, there was no confidence, no bluster. Henyard entered the courtroom with none of her usual cocky confidence. Gone were the designer clothes, the lavish press conferences, and the air of invincibility. The judge took his seat, and as the room fell silent, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. The moment Henyard had dreaded was finally here at first. Henyard appeared calm, almost as if she thought the charges against her were merely a misunderstanding, a political witch hunt. However, as the prosecutor began to list each questionable transaction, unethical decision, and taxpayer dollar that had gone missing under her watch, Henyard's composure quickly began to crumble. Her face shifted, and she subtly glanced at her legal team. They, too, knew what was coming. The prosecutor, however, wasted no time in presenting damning evidence. The most shocking of all, a $43,000 Amazon shopping spree funded by taxpayer money, along with first-class flights, luxury hotels, and billboards that plastered Henyard's face all over the town. These were not small, incidental charges. They were blatant, extravagant expenditures that painted a clear picture of corruption. The jury, a group of locals who had once trusted her, watched intently as the charges piled up. Many exchanged glances of disgust and disappointment, but the real bombshell came when the prosecutor presented fresh evidence. Emails, wire transfers, and confidential agreements directly tied Henyard to a string of back-to-back transactions that funneled public funds into private accounts. Screenshots of these documents appeared on the courtroom screen, sending shockwaves through the room. Some of Henyard's most loyal supporters gasped, while her legal team scrambled to refute the evidence. But there was little they could say in her defense. Henyard's carefully crafted image as an untouchable political figure was crumbling before everyone's eyes. She tried to remain composed, but her eyes darted nervously toward the door. It was as though she was contemplating making a dramatic exit. The judge's voice broke the tension, ordering that the trial continue. However, by then, the damage was done. The evidence was undeniable, and the courtroom felt the shifter defense team, clearly under pressure, tried to mount a last-ditch effort to salvage her reputation. They claimed that Henyard was a victim of political sabotage, that the evidence was misinterpreted, and that the accusations were nothing more than an attack on a powerful woman. But the jury wasn't buying it. They had seen the evidence, specific, irrefutable proof that Henyard had misappropriated taxpayer dollars for her personal gain. The prosecution had drawn sharp contrast between her claims of being a champion for the people and the reality of her actions. Henyard had used the town's resources to fund lavish trips, stay in expensive hotels, and indulge in personal shopping sprees, all while the residents of Dalton faced rising taxes, crumbling infrastructure, and cuts to essential services. As the prosecution continued to present evidence, a key witness, once a trusted member of Henyard's inner circle, stepped forward. The betrayal was evident as the former ally exposed behind-the-scenes corruption and manipulation. Henyard had fostered a culture of fear, where anyone who dared speak out was threatened. The room filled with outrage as the witness detailed how Henyard had used her power to silence dissent and control her administration. The mayor's reputation as a strong leader was beginning to look like a facade built on deceit and intimidation. Henyard, still trying to hold on to control, was visibly rattled. Her face betrayed a mixture of shock and anger as the weight of the accusation sank in. She had always believed herself to be invincible, that her power and influence could shield her from the consequences of her actions. But the trial was exposing her for what she truly was, a corrupt politician whose greed had destroyed the very people she was elected to serve. As the judge called for a recess, Henyard's temper finally boiled over. Known for her ability to command any room, she stood up abruptly, challenging the legitimacy of the proceedings. In an emotional outburst, she screamed that it was all a setup, that the entire system was conspiring against her. She accused the courtroom of being unable to handle a strong black woman in power. Her words echoed through the room, and the jury exchanged uneasy glances. Henyard's emotional eruption caught everyone off guard. Her legal team rushed to her side, urging her to remain calm, but it was clear that she had lost control. "I'll walk out of here," she yelled defiantly, before turning toward the door, fully expecting to leave the courtroom. The judge, however, was not about to let her escape that easily. The court officers quickly intervened, but Henyard's outburst was a clear sign of how much the pressure had taken a toll on her. She was no longer the calm, collected politician who once dominated the local political scene. She was a woman on the brink of a meltdown as Henyard attempted to storm out. The room buzzed with disbelief. Reporters scrambled to capture every moment of the drama unfolding in front of them. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a public reckoning for a woman who had once been untouchable. The anger in the room was palpable. Henyard, who had once thrived on confrontation and power, now appeared vulnerable. Unprepared for the consequences of her actions, was this the beginning of the end for Tiffany Henyard? Could she recover from this public spectacle, or had the damage to her reputation become irreparable? The people of Dalton were watching closely, and it was clear that their once strong faith in her leadership was now in serious doubt. Would they stand by her, as she seemed to believe, or would they demand accountability for the trail of corruption she had left in her wake? The courtroom drama had escalated from a political trial into a spectacle of emotions, and the public's reaction was only growing more intense. Henyard's supporters were dwindling, while the number of those calling for her resignation continued to rise. The evidence of corruption was overwhelming, and her emotional breakdown had only further fueled perception that she was losing control, not just of the trial, but her political future as the trial continued. One thing was clear. Tiffany Henyard's days as mayor were numbered. The question now wasn't whether she could survive the trial, but whether she could survive the consequences of her actions. For the people of Dalton, the once promising future they had hoped for seemed increasingly out of reach as they watched their mayor's career collapse in a whirlwind of scandal and disgrace as Tiffany Henyard attempted to storm out of courtroom. An unexpected turn of events occurred. Federal agents, who had been quietly observing proceedings from the back, suddenly moved forward, halting her in her tracks. They presented official-looking documents and calmly informed her that she needed to come with them. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted dramatically, and a heavy silence fell over the room. Henyard, once the unshakable figure of power in Dalton, was now faced with federal authorities who were not there for a political spectacle, but for serious legal matters. Her supporters, who had been vocally cheering her on, were now paralyzed with shock and uncertainty. The woman who had once commanded the room with sheer force of will was suddenly powerless in the face of the law. Henyard, realizing she had no control of the situation, felt the weight of the moment sink in. Her attorneys quickly moved in, whispering urgent instructions for her to leave without further escalation. But Henyard, never one to back down from a challenge, squared her shoulders, defiantly facing the agents. "This is harassment," she shouted, her voice echoing through the now-still room. "This is political persecution." Her defiant words bounced off the walls, but those in the courtroom who had seen her display similar fiery outbursts before were unmoved. This time, there was no applause, no adoration, only a growing sense of disbelief as a facade she had so carefully constructed began to crumble. One of the federal agents, calm and collected, responded with quiet authority. "Miss Henyard, we need you to come with us for further questioning. This is not an arrest at this moment." The words hit Henyard like a ton of bricks. The investigation had been quietly simmering for months had now reached a pivotal moment, and the agent's appearance in the courtroom signaled that her situation was far more serious than she had ever imagined. For the first time, Henyard's mind raced with a sense of real fear. She had long relied on insider information, reassurances from people within her circle who told her that the investigations would go nowhere. She had always been certain that her influence would protect her from the consequences of her actions. But now, as the agents blocked her path and the reality of the situation set in, she understood that her world was unraveling. The reporters, who had been documenting the trial's proceedings, were now focused entirely on Henyard. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment of her downfall in real time. Social media exploded with news of the dramatic turn of events. The words "meltdown" quickly trended across timelines as Henyard's once unassailable confidence shifted into something far more vulnerable. Federal agents from multiple agencies moved into position, blocking her way with stern, unreadable faces. They were a striking contrast to the woman who had once been the dominant force in Dalton's politics. Henyard, who had spent years positioning herself as a figure above reproach, now looked like a liability rather than a leader. Her supporters, who had once cheered her at rallies, now watched in stunned silence as the mighty mayor was confronted with the reality of her legal troubles. Some of her most loyal followers attempted to rally behind her, shouting accusations of setup and injustice, but others quietly slipped away, unsure of how to process the abrupt shift in power. The sudden chaos in the courtroom was unlike anything anyone had expected as Henyard moved to the courthouse halls. Cameras followed her every step. Each flash of the camera felt like another piece of her carefully curated image falling apart. Her lawyer, tugging at her sleeve, urged her to keep moving, to keep her composure. But Henyard, eyes blazing with determination, stormed down the hall, pushing through the courthouse doors, still hoping she could salvage the situation. Yet, as she moved forward, it became clear that her fall from grace had only just begun. The true betrayal came from within her own ranks. A key witness from Henyard's administration, once one of her closest allies, now turned against her. This former confidant stepped forward, ready to testify about the behind-the-scenes corruption, intimidation, and manipulation that had defined Henyard's time in office. The witness's words fell like a bombshell, and the room fell into stunned silence. The testimony revealed that Henyard's reign was not just a political scandal. It was a collapse of a regime built on deceit, fear, and control. Henyard, her face frozen in a mix of shock and rage, realized the gravity of the situation. She had always believed herself to be untouchable, relying on her influence and connections to shield her from any consequences. But now, in front of the world, the truth was being laid bare. The walls were closing in, and her political empire was crumbling before her eyes as the judge called for a recess, allowing both sides to regroup before the final decision. Henyard, ever the strategist, saw an opportunity. This was the moment where she could regain control of the narrative, as she had done so many times before. She could try to talk her way out of it, spin the situation in her favor, and return to her previous position of power. But this time, the weight of the accusations and the mounting pressure proved to be too much. The gavel struck, signaling the end of the recess, and Henyard's frustration boiled over. She shot up from her seat, gripping the edge of the table, her pulse racing. She had never been one to sit quietly, to allow anyone else to dominate the room. As the judge prepared to leave, Henyard's rage exploded. "This is a setup. This is all lies," she screamed, her voice reverberating through the room. "You just can't handle a strong black woman in power." The words echoed off the walls, a final desperate attempt to turn the tide in her favor. The courtroom erupted in shock and disbelief. Reporters scrambled to capture every moment. The jury exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of how to process the outburst. The prosecution stood with their arms folded, offering no visible reaction, silently observing Henyard's unraveling. Henyard, undeterred, turned on her heels, convinced that she could still salvage the situation. She stormed toward the door, fully expecting to leave the courtroom and regain some semblance of control. But as she reached the door, she was once again stopped by the federal agents, who had been quietly observing the chaos unfold. They moved in swiftly, preventing her from leaving. Calmly, they told her to settle down. "Miss Henyard," one of them said, his voice unwavering, "we need you to come with us for further questioning for a moment." There was a deafening silence. The weight of the moment hung heavily in the air. Henyard's once formidable presence had turned into a spectacle of defeat. Even her most devoted supporters, those who had stood by her side through thick and thin, now watched in stunned silence. They too could see that Henyard's grip on power was slipping away. Henyard stood frozen in place, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in. This was not how she had envisioned the day going. Sure, she had anticipated a tough decision from the judge, but this was something entirely different. Federal agents were here, documents in hand, and the carefully constructed world she had lived in for so long was crashing down around her. Her attorneys rushed to her side, urging her to leave without making a scene. "We need to go now," one of them whispered urgently. But Henyard, ever the fighter, wasn't ready to accept defeat. She squared her shoulders, clenched her fists, and shot a defiant glare at the lead agent as Tiffany Henyard stood there. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The once unstoppable mayor, who had controlled every room she entered, now found herself powerless in front of the very system she had once thought she could control. The agent stood firm, the eyes of the world upon her, and the final chapter of her political career seemed to be unfolding right before her eyes. Finally, the agent spoke again, his voice calm and methodical. "Miss Henyard, we need you to come with us for further questioning." It was a simple request, but for Tiffany Henyard, it felt like a crushing blow. The courtroom was filled with an eerie silence as Tiffany Henyard was confronted by federal agents. Though her arrest had not been finalized, it was clear that the investigation had reached a point where her power and influence could no longer shield her. Henyard, who had always prided herself on being one step ahead, manipulating situations to her advantage, was now caught off guard. The federal authorities were not here for a political spectacle or to intimidate. No, they had come for something much more serious. This was an arrest, yet the gravity of the situation was undeniable. Tiffany had always relied on insider connections, reassured by whispers that nothing would come to federal investigation. She believed she was untouchable, the kind of person whose influence could protect her from any consequence. But now, as federal agents from multiple agencies blocked her path, creating an unbreachable wall between her and any semblance of control. The harsh reality began to sink in. The situation was slipping through her fingers faster than she could regain hold outside. Cameras clicked away, capturing the dramatic turn of events. Social media exploded with real-time reports, with hashtags like hashtag Bora and hashtag Yo trending globally as the spectacle unfolded. Tiffany's loyal supporters, once unwavering in their faith, were thrown into chaos. Some loyalists screamed accusations of a setup, attempted to defend her, but others quietly began retracting their support. They could no longer ignore the growing scandal that consumed their once beloved mayor of the room, that had been her domain for years, now felt foreign, hostile even. Tiffany Henyard, the unstoppable force who once commanded every room she entered, was now rendered powerless. Her lawyer, ever the pragmatist, urged her to move forward with haste. But Henyard, with fire in her eyes and teeth gritted in frustration, ignored the advice and stormed through the courtroom doors. She was flanked by agents now, her every move recorded, her every step a mark of her downfall as she walked through the courthouse halls. Each step felt like an act of personal humiliation. The realization of her political reign coming to an abrupt, public end pressed on her like an unrelenting weight. Commentators echoed the sentiment, some even remarking, "I came in expecting a courtroom victory, but she's leaving with federal agents by her side." News reporters surged forward, microphones in hand, hurling questions as fast as they could. "Are you under investigation for corruption? Do you have a statement? Is it true the FBI has a case against you? Will you resign?" Tiffany's face twitched with annoyance, but she ignored the barrage of questions. She knew better than to offer them another soundbite, another opportunity to spin her downfall further. Instead, she focused on what was left of her narrative, trying desperately to control what little she could once inside the federal building. Her PR team scrambled to issue a statement. They called it a political witch hunt, a deliberate attempt by the authorities to silence a powerful woman who dared to challenge the status quo. However, as leaks from within the investigation began to emerge, it became evident that the reality was far darker than Henyard could spin the allegations piled on quickly. Corruption charges were only the beginning. Investigators uncovered claims of financial mismanagement, intimidation tactics, and even secret offshore accounts. The details became more troubling with each passing day. Whistleblowers came forward, confirming long-held suspicions that taxpayer funds meant for community programs had been funneled into dubious consulting fees and unexecuted special projects. The revelations were mounting, and Henyard's world was rapidly spiraling into chaos. Then, a bombshell dropped. A secret audio recording surfaced, purportedly capturing a conversation between Henyard and an unnamed individual. The recording spread like wildfire across social media, with hashtags like hashtag Kennard and hashtag closed trending globally. In the grainy audio, Henyard's voice could be heard sneering, "They wouldn't dare speak against me. If they do, we'll make sure they regret it." The internet had a field day with the leak, dissecting every word and circulating memes that painted her as a power-hungry villain. The public's perception shifted immediately, drawing direct comparisons between Henyard and some of the most notorious corrupt politicians in history. Inside Henyard's inner circle, panic reigned. Her team was in freefall, desperately trying to contain the damage. Lawyers attempted to discredit the audio, claiming it was a misrepresentation of her words, but the damage had already been done. The truth was slipping beyond her control. Even her staunchest supporters, including local politicians and influencers, began distancing themselves from her. They realized that the scandal was too vast, too overwhelming, to ignore on primetime television. Anchors declared that Henyard's political career was in its final moments. Tiffany Henyard's walls are closing in, they said, as reporters speculated on the severity of the charges she faced, including the possibility of jail time. The accusations held up meanwhile. Inside the federal interrogation room, Henyard sat across from a team of investigators. The woman who had once manipulated public perception to suit her needs now faced the harsh truth of a federal investigation. Her usual confidence was gone. The pressure was mounting, and the lead investigator, unfazed by her earlier bravado, slid a thick folder of evidence across the table. Each page told a grim story. Bank statements showing sizable deposits from a mysterious shell company linked to government contracts, emails outlining favors for private entities, and documents bearing her signature that had already raised suspicions. The investigator leaned in, his voice cold and steady. "You can keep playing this game, or you can start telling us the truth," he said. "Because right now we have enough to take this all the way." For the first time in her career, Tiffany Henyard's defiant facade began to crack. Her smile faded as she stared at the documents laid out before her. The final document slid across the table, a signed approval of a deal flagged as highly suspicious. As she stared at it, the weight of her options pressing on her like a vice. There was no escape now. The world outside the interrogation room was already moving on. Reporters prepared their evening broadcasts, speculating on her downfall, while social media buzzed with discussions about who might replace her. Citizens who had once supported Henyard were eagerly waiting for the next chapter in this unfolding scandal. She had no way of knowing it, but her political empire was already crumbling inside the room. Tiffany sat stiffly in her chair, arms crossed, tapping her polished nails nervously against the cold metal table. The walls had closed in around her. She was alone, her lawyers nowhere to be seen. The reality of her situation had finally hit. She was not in control. Anymore, the investigator continued to flip through the file, each page more incriminating than the last. Offshore account deposits, invoices for non-existent community projects, emails laying bare a network of backdoor deals. Miss Henyard, the investigator said with a shake of his head, this is much bigger than negative press or political rivalry. He slid yet another document toward her, a sworn statement from a former aide. We've dealt with politicians like you before, he said. They all believe they're untouchable until they're not. Tiffany tried to force a smirk, but it didn't reach her eyes. This is absurd. A smear campaign, and you don't have a case. She shot back, but the words fell hollow. It was at that moment that the full gravity of the situation truly hit her. She wasn't in control anymore. The door, once a potential escape route, stood silent. Her lawyers were nowhere to be seen. She was alone. Anger and fear collided in her chest as her options evaporated. The walls were closing in, and she could feel the air growing thick with the impending collapse of everything she had built outside the interrogation room. The political world was erupting in chaos. News of Henyard's federal questioning spread like wildfire. The headlines were swift and unforgiving. Analysts compared her downfall to infamous political scandals of the past, speculating on the severity of the charges she might face, including the possibility of jail time. The city council, long a supporter of Henyard, held an emergency meeting broadcast live to the public. One trustee who had once been loyal stood before the cameras and declared, "This administration has failed our city." For the first time, Henyard's political empire seemed to crumble in real time. The trustee continued, calling for an immediate investigation, a forensic audit, and if necessary, her removal from office. The public, once behind her, was now clamoring for justice. Demonstrations broke out outside City Hall, with citizens holding signs demanding her arrest. Some protesters even called for an investigation into all politicians who had supported her. The tide had turned decisively against Henyard. The support she once commanded seemed like a distant memory inside the interrogation room. Tiffany's desperation became palpable. She was no longer the powerful leader who had once bent the political system to her will. She was a politician fighting for survival. The investigation had shifted from mere allegations to a full-blown crisis, and the walls seemed to be closing in from every side. Her defenders had deserted her. Her political network was collapsing. The citizens who had once supported her were now demanding answers despite her best efforts to deny the charges and fight back. It became increasingly clear that Tiffany Henyard's days in power were numbered. In a last-ditch effort to limit the damage, she released a video statement. In it, she stuck to standard talking points. This is just a politically motivated attack. I have devoted my life to serving this city, and the truth will be revealed. I will not be intimidated. The internet, however, wasn't buying it. Comment sections flooded with backlash. Now you want to talk after all the money you stole? One comment read, "Where's the fake news when we have documents, recordings, and witnesses? You're done. Just resign." But Tiffany refused to back down. She called a press conference. Defiant as ever, though reporters weren't letting her off the hook, Miss Henyard. They pressed. How do you respond to the mounting allegations? Tiffany stood her ground, accusing the media, her political rivals, and even the federal government of unfairly targeting her. "This is an attack on strong, independent leadership," she exclaimed. "They want to silence me because I didn't follow their rules." But it didn't matter. The narrative had already turned against her that night. After the major news stations had concluded their coverage, a bombshell dropped. FBI agents, backed by state officials, executed a search warrant at Henyard's residence and workplace. It was the first time federal agents had raided the home of a sitting mayor, and reporters flooded the scene. Agents carted away boxes of documents, hard drives, and computers. The image of Tiffany Henyard handcuffed and escorted from her property went viral within minutes. The charges, wire fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy to commit bribery, carried the potential for long prison sentences. Legal experts speculated on TV that Henyard could face over 20 years behind bars if convicted as the evidence piled up. Many believed that a plea deal might be her only option. The city erupted in a mix of celebration, shock, and resigned anticipation. Some citizens felt like they had seen this downfall coming from miles away by morning. The political landscape had shifted completely. Allies who had once praised her were now distancing themselves. Investigators revealed that other officials tied to Tiffany were now under investigation, and the city was preparing for new leadership. Tiffany's story, however, wasn't over just yet. Through her lawyers, she sent one last defiant message from behind bars. This is far from over. The truth will come out whether this was a final act of defiance or the last card she had to play remained to be seen. The rise and fall of Tiffany Henyard, from a powerful mayor to a woman in jail, would be written into the city's history books. Was this truly the end of her political career, or was there more to the story? As always, politicians like Tiffany Henyard had a knack for survival, no matter how deep the scandal. The true question remained: is Tiffany Henyard finished for good, or does she have one final move left?